South Africa's former public protector, advocate Thuli Madonsela, raised the eye of some recently when she suggests that the public servants implicated in grand corruption should be given the chance to apply for amnesty. Some pundits say Madonsela's timing is especially unfortunate, adding that it is only in very recent times that the hawks and other agencies of the criminal justice system appear to have recovered the institutional capacity to begin prosecuting those responsible for the deep-lying state capture project. To speak more about recent developments, including reports suggesting that the State Capture Commission has widened its net of those it's looking into, Professor Somadoda Fikeni is a political analyst. He joins me now. Very good evening to you, Professor Fikeni, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. What are your thoughts about these weekend reports suggesting that the State Capture Commission could be looking into what is being referred to a former President Jacob Zuma's network?
Well, I do think that we expected that they would close in, especially on the person who is of their primary interest, the former president, because very often many of the witnesses do point fingers in that direction. Of course, it might then be important for them to verify some of the issues, and they might be reaching the capacity of forensic and intelligence report in terms of the financial flows. That in itself, I think, is what they might be looking at this stage, because so far, nothing has directly implicated the former president, except that he exercised influence. He seemed to have looked the other way around, or he seemed to have allowed the space and people around him to exercise their influence and use his name. So that in itself would be the direct link if any findings were to come.
I find it quite curious that one of the Sunday papers ran a story speaking about a woman who's seeking divorce from a former president who obviously could not be named, and she seemed to point to a network of people outside of the state, South Africa, in other outlying areas who actually have financial muscle of deals that he possibly could have benefited from, and that there were then reports of other people who were previously linked to the president who've been linked into, and almost every single one of them, including the former EFF president, was saying they wouldn't understand why they're being looked into.
Indeed, at this stage, we may not know the exact logic and the approach and the strategy of the Zondo Commission, but it is quite clear, because many questions have been raised, to say if questions are raised around certain people having benefited, if questions are raised around certain people being influential, the only link to them would be through forensic investigation, and that in itself would, among other things, be looking at the financial flows. But that other political leaders are being drawn in, we may not immediately know at this stage, until and unless the Zondo Commission, presents the case as to how these linkages are. And besides, this is a wide scope investigation, as it states, and it looks like there are many other people who are being brought into focus. But at this stage, we are merely speculating.
Well, Professor Fikeni, share your views. One of your colleagues writing an opinion paper suggesting that the systemic corruption in this country is so bad that the central state has almost lost power because there's so many other parallel states, illegal states, which she calls, that are being run not only by opposition parties but criminal networks and including traditional leaders. That corruption has taken root so badly that we're seeing a state of collapse of the state. Your thoughts on that?
Indeed, we may not have reached the state of collapse of the state, but it is clear that we have a very weak state. And it is clear that we do have a deep state where several other networks which have operated parallel to the state, overriding the formal institutions, are there. And it is quite clear that we can be classified as a patrimonial state where patronage and corruption are quite a dominant feature.
At which point do we say the state has collapsed? And I want to further repeat what he said. He was looking at the Latin American experience as an example of how things can quickly unravel. Could South Africa go that way, or the route of other African countries? And I'm sure you'd recall this, your colleagues from the continent warning South Africa at the onset of democracy that we would walk the very same route that other fallen African states have walked.
Well, when you look at some of the states, such as Somalia, you could talk of a failed state. When you look at Libya at this stage, where the state has lost the complete control, South African institutions, some of them are still very strong, and they're still operational. You still have the judiciary, you still have others. But what has happened is that where leaders have collapsed institutions, trying to put in their own friends and their networks, then individuals became more important than the institution itself. That's when you begin to have a parallel operation to the legal operation. And that is what many investigations around corruption are going to unravel and are beginning to show. Only if we do nothing about those and the situation further deteriorates, that we can talk of a collapsed state or a failed state.
But tell us in South Africa, in what form, what characteristics are evident that they are perfectly legal, self-sufficient states? I mean, we've seen in the past certain communities wanting to be granted autonomy purely because of what they see as the failure of the governing party to govern, the fact that public service delivery is non-existent in some areas. What characteristics are there that we are going down a very dangerous path where there will be more and more legal self-sufficient states?
Well, the real serious challenge here is the crisis of leadership within the ruling party, which has been a ruling party since 1994. The ruling party increasingly is spending more energies fighting factional battles instead of prioritizing national interests. The second serious crisis comes with the main opposition party also having its own serious crisis. And the third crisis comes when we are in a deep recession, which for some might even be a depression, to a point where we may not fulfill some of the functions, and state-owned companies, which are supposed to be the bulwark that lifts us into economic growth, are themselves needing bailout. That we are on a brink of a serious crisis if it is not fundamentally addressed. Inequality, of course, is always a recurring problem, manifesting itself in all forms, whether the legacy of the colonial and the apartheid past or the recently created inequalities.
So, Professor Fikeni, let's explore that a little further. As you say, in all forms, I was struck by a young lady from Philippines saying yesterday that because of the extent of poverty in that area, people are forced to do whatever it takes to find some form of livelihood or to create opportunities for income, as she called them. Have we become that country where people have found a way of explaining away corruption? It's become a norm because we live in what is perceived to be a corrupt state.
To some degree, that is correct in a sense, because those who are in a formal state, and some of them are being exposed to be involved in corruption. Even those who are seemingly in functioning entities such as the banking institutions, the more you have inequalities, the more systemic biases are actually exposed, including racial bias in terms of development finances and even the bonds for some. The more people begin to understand that we are tinkling with the edges by talking about public sector corruption when, in essence, the very essence and the structural arrangement of the country is based on corruption on a giant form. And some of this corruption is simply regulated and it looks normal. Recently, there was investigation into Discovery Bank, medical insurance, the same problems. And now we have learned that even the audit firms do actually assist in this process. As you see Steinhoff, swindling of billions not being investigated, increasingly people say, well, it looks like we are a crime scene as a country generally, and it simply differs whether it's a white-collar crime or a blue-collar crime.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor Somadoda Fikeni. Would have loved to ask you what you thought about that suggestion of a possible amnesty for public servants. Would it yield to more rot being exposed? Well, that's a conversation for another day. But still to come.